So we all know Daniela Gachago very well, and I almost want to say welcome home, but you now at UCT. So Daniela is an associate professor at the Center for Innovation for Learning and Teaching at the University of Cape Town. Her research focuses on academic staff development in the use of emerging technologies to transform teaching and learning in higher education, with a particular focus on socially just pedagogies such as digital stories. And yes, we know Daniela for the digital stories. She put it on the map for us at CPUT. She's also interested in innovative course and curriculum design, drawing from co-creative approaches such as design thinking. She completed a master's in adult education at the University of Botswana and received a PhD from the School of Education at the University of Cape Town. She has published more than 50 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, and many of us here have worked with her in some capacity and published articles with her. She's also the managing editor of Crystal, the Journal for Critical Studies in Teaching and Learning in Higher Education. So welcome, Daniela, and we are very excited to hear your presentation today.
Thank you so much, Nadra. It's so lovely to be back. I was so happy this morning. I told everyone at home that I'm going to present at CPUT. I'm going to be back. And when I saw you wearing your CPUT t-shirt, actually, I should have worn a CPUT. So it's lovely to be back, and thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share some of my ideas today. And I mean, listening to Zina, I'm like, she has already said everything. So, apologies if I am going to, repeat some of what Zina already shared. What I thought I'll do today is, I mean, most of you know our learning design work. Many of you have been at our learning design workshops over the last years, and what I thought I'd present today is how my thinking has changed or has developed over the last, through the pandemic. What some of the changes we have made when we think about learning design. So my presentation is entitled "Towards Compassionate Learning Design for the Pandemic and Beyond." But I think before I start, I just want to see quickly in the chat, how are you feeling today? I think we haven't heard from the audience yet. Just type quickly in the chat how you are, and maybe where you're seated, and I'll see. Hi. Oh, hi, Justin. So nice to see you. Oh, Hanley, I'm so sorry. I know it's the end of the year. Hey, oh, Roderick, fantastic. Lisa, hi. Hi, Bronwyn. Oh, yeah. I think, Hillary, that's how we all feel, the last few weeks. Hi, Kathy. Oh, it's so beautiful to see all these familiar names. Oh, hi, Lauren. Lovely to see you. Hi, Lisa. Oh, cool. Thank you so much. Hi. Hi, Zina. Good to see you all. Okay, so this is my presentation. I know I've just got half an hour, so I have to be really, really quick. I mean, some of this has already been shared by Zina, so I can move on very quickly around COVID and remote or emergency teaching and learning and how it has impacted us in higher education. I'm going to bring some data from the UFS CHE Staff Experience Survey, which was released, I think, 2 weeks ago, which is quite interesting, I thought. And I'll speak about something that I've been thinking about quite a lot. In our learning design processes, we have always foregrounded empathy, drawing from user-centered design, starting with activities such as the persona activity to really understand or bring the learners into the design space. But what I've been thinking about, what if you changed empathy with compassion? What if you replace that, and would that help us make sense of or find a more sustainable way forward in terms of learning design? And then I'll introduce some ideas that we've been thinking about, together with Nicola Palit and Mahabala, we've been trying to develop a new kind of learning design model that we thought for the pandemic, but also beyond. So, I mean, we know COVID-19 has been the major disruption in the history of education. For many, it's a long needed rethink of higher education provision. I must say, I can't see the chat. So if there's anything in the chat, maybe you can just stop me. And currently, I can't see the chat when I'm on, full screen. So it has allowed for much more flexible, open, accessible models of education. So for people like us who have been working in this space, this has really allowed us to rethink, what we are doing, and to move towards something that, we have been long fighting for or working with, and where we have often encountered a lot of resistance. And suddenly during COVID, a lot of stuff was suddenly possible, such as, I'll never forget, when engineering moved to online summative assessments, which really we never ever thought would be possible, but suddenly COVID allowed that to happen. But we also know that, the move to online learning was extremely quick. CPT was quite lucky because it had 2-3 months to prepare, much longer than many other institutions. So in terms of thinking about how to move online, CPT might have had a bit of an advantage in relation to others, but still, I think globally people have recognized that there was also a lack of learning design. So what we did, and that's where this terminology of remote teaching and learning came from, just to make sure and make clear that what most institutions were doing was not well-designed online learning, but was really a rushed move towards something just to get us going. And I'm sure you have seen this, this depiction of the phases that many institutions went through, from this very rushed, rapid transition to remote teaching and learning, very little learning design, just moving what we are doing face-to-face into an online space, moving our lectures into Zoom or MS Team, and then slowly adding the basics, thinking about learning design, thinking about what would happen if that was, a more sustained or more long-term development. How could we reintegrate, or how could we rethink how we are doing things? As Zina also said, what did we have to unlearn? What did we have to relearn? And now we are in a space where some institutions have gone back to face and have kind of also not comfortably. I know it is not easy to come back to campus. There's a lot of fear around that, a lot of insecurity, a lot of discomfort, and others have moved quite strongly towards a more online or blended learning format. So as I said, I'm going to touch briefly on some of the results from the staff experience offering perspectives on teaching and learning in its future survey report that has just come up. That last year, if you remember, they focused on student perspectives. This year, they focused more on staff perspectives. So they asked, and it's quite interesting because they had kind of two foci. They asked academic staff about their experiences and their thoughts about the future of teaching and learning, but they also asked management. So there's an interesting leadership experience there too. And what I found really interesting is that it seems as if the concerns or the challenges have changed over the years. So while last year most of us were mostly worried about access, about how to get resources and content to our students, how to manage assessments and assignments. This year, what has come up also in conversations with staff is there's a much more worry about the lack of interaction, the lack of engagement, the lack of people feel. So what I've read, at least from the UCT comments, that's the data we got, like in raw format, is that there's a lot of anxiety around, we are teaching. We have learned how to move our content online. We have learned how to do online assessments, but do we actually know what our students are learning? People feel how do we understand progress? How do we understand whether our students are actually engaging with the content? That sense that there's no response from our students. And that's really the most difficult part with online learning, is how to get that engagement going, how to get that relationship. Teaching is relational, as Zina said, teaching is a relationship between you know, the teacher and the students and the students and the students and the students and the content, as we know, and the student as on the context. So, and the students and community. So how do we recreate that relationship, that social presence? You know, that's so easy in a face-to-face environment. How do we recreate that online? That seems to be really the strongest concern across all institutions. This is the data across all the 26 institutions that took part. But what's also interesting, I found, I mean, that students don't have access to the necessary resources. I mean, that's still a big concern. But there's also a huge concern from staff, you know, how to keep up with their research and the other stuff they're doing. These last 2 years have been really focused on teaching and learning, which for some of us who work in that space has been fantastic, because suddenly teaching and learning has gotten the kind of interest and focus and concern that we have been really, you know, fighting for a very long time. But at the same time, you know, research has, for example, had to take a backdrop. And what's also really interesting, number 4 concern, is, you know, staff's challenge to switch off. You know, we work from home, there's no boundary anymore, you know, work just continues, as we all know. There's never, WhatsApp never stops, you know, our students request, our staff request. It's like we haven't learned how to create boundaries, how to create a conducive, sustainable work environment at home. And I mean, these are similar biggest concerns, you know, again, you know, student access, academic honesty, diminished quality of my interaction with students. But I think what I'm also really interested is this sense of complete burnout and fatigue and collective, you know, exhaustion across, you know, with whoever one you talk. And you can see there has 75%, and this is to a large extent very much. That's the data of, you know, 75% of all our staff say that they have very much experienced an increased workload. 71% they have, to a large extent, are struggling with balancing home and work life. 53% are saying, to a large extent, they experience burnout. I mean, this is data that I think has to sink in. More than half of all the respondents to the survey have said that they're actually very much burnt out. I mean, that's something for me that is extremely scary and needs to, you know, be thought of and engaged with really, really carefully. And, you know, isolation, alienation, Zina has said that is part of this picture. And as I said, this is, you know, to a large extent, we only have access to the UCT data, but this is the data when you look at everybody who has experienced some of this, you know, and 97% increased workload, 88% have, you know, had challenges balancing home and work life. 87% have experienced some degree of burnout. I think this is really, really important, and we have to look at that. And the result of that for a lot of people is a real sense of, you know, alienation, exhaustion, but also kind of detachment. You know, I mean, these are some comments from the UCT data. You know, I feel the same about most, not all of my colleagues, a general sense of depression, disengagement from the work, making me feel bitter and resentful. I mean, these are things that we have to deal with. I find I'm less engaged with the educational outcome. I care less. I assume they're doing well as I don't see them. That's, you know, them, the students. So what we, I think, also need to consider is that lockdown is really, really lonely for everyone, for lecturers, for students, for, you know, between colleagues, between a sense of alienation towards institution, and mainly because of these loss of relationships that we are having, you know, that we used to have face to face. And because teaching and learning is relational, in many of the open-ended comments, the sense is that, you know, if we don't have that relationship, we are actually not teaching. What is it that we're doing if we can't sense the relationship? And there's this real sense of grief, of mourning, of loss about that sense of that we are not, you know, reaching our students. And I really love that, you know, comment. What I miss in online teaching is the learning that takes place in the in-between spaces. I mean, you know, I've been really interested in like learning in third spaces and, you know, in that in-between spaces, which I think is so important. So how can we recreate these in-between spaces online? Those are things we have to think about. So, you know, for me, it has this lack of learning design. actually led to a collective burnout? Those are questions that I've been thinking about. And if it has, what kind of learning design would we need to move us on into a more sustainable, you know, space where what we have to do, we can do actually longer instead of just burning out. So, I mean, people who have worked with see it, you know these learning design models, we have drawn a lot from user-centric design from the school, from the D school, integrating these processes. And we always start with empathy, the persona development that is kind of key in the work we've been doing. But empathy also kind of, I've been struggling recently, with this empathy, because, and this is mirrored in some of the comments that we got also from this, from the survey, that sense that empathy is not enough. I mean, it's fine to be empathetic and to try and put yourself into somebody else's shoe, but empathy doesn't necessarily include action. It doesn't necessarily include something that would take us forward, that would do something with, with what we are seeing and what we are experiencing. So in my PhD many years ago, I actually, engaged a lot with the differences between empathy and compassion, and how in my PhD, it was in response to stories of trauma, and the differences if I respond with empathy or if I respond with compassion. And I'd like to know from you, in your experience, and I mean, I'm back in the chat, what is the difference between empathy and compassion? What do you think would be the differences? And maybe just Nadra, could you remind me until when do I have?
Sorry, Daniela. You have until 10 to 10 to 10.
So maybe just some comments in the chat. What do you think would be the difference if we, rather than thinking about empathy, we were thinking about compassion? I know it's not an easy question, and often it's used interchangeably. Okay, Bromwell says action. Okay, it includes action. Anything else? A gentler, more human, interesting. Okay, demonstration of empathy. Compassion is the act of kindness and caring. Interesting. Thank you. Compassion includes care. Yeah. Lovely. Yeah. Empathy, but with a clear head and not being taken advantage. Interesting. So there's some sort of, distance also when you do compassion that allows you to kind of step back. Yeah. Action, compassion, reacting on what you experience with empathy. Interesting. So thank you so much. I mean, this is really helpful. So these are just some definitions, of compassion that I've used in my PhD, and I had to go back to this. This is really many years ago. But compassion is really the place where we feel, we think, and we act come together. So it's not this immediate response, but it allows some sort of, sitting back, reflecting, thinking how to respond, how to react in a way that is caring and compassionate for all of us. And also understanding what I like about that, it's not just an individual response, but it's also understanding how my individual response relates to the larger context, to understanding the social and political structures of our society, in addition to responding to individuals. So it is, somebody said it's discomfortable. I think it's also Zina said, we are in a really uncomfortable situation, an uncomfortable context. So it's not just recognizing somebody else's suffering, understanding that everyone suffers, having feelings, but maybe also understanding that, I always say, empathy might be putting myself in somebody else's shoe. Compassion is understanding that I can never actually do that, because my place of experience, my positioning is always different. So there will always be something I don't understand. And that is for me such an important, such an important insight, especially when we go into learning design. So this is part of a chapter that we're working on with Nicola and Maha, and we kind of sat down and said, okay, if we, how would we have to redefine our learning process or learning design process to be more more meaningful or more appropriate to respond to current situations. And these are kind of 4 elements that we think are really the core of a learning design process, and nothing is new. I mean, Zina, the flux pedagogy, there are so many people who kind of think about how to create more compassionate learning designs, more critical, more relational learning design. But for us, we just try to put all these resources and elements and articles that we are engaging with into a really easy framework that we can work with. And part of it is that everything has to be based on care and affect. I mean, that is like it's so interesting because these are not new ideas. I mean, pedagogies of care and pedagogies of compassion and, vulnerability, all of this has been around for so many years. But during the pandemic, suddenly it seemed to have gained momentum and has become a lot more mainstream and accepted because we were, just as Zina said, all in these situations where we are completely exhausted, we are overwhelmed, we are dealing with something we are not at all used to, and we kind of understood that care and compassion has to be at the fore, in how we engage with this. But justice, the inequities that have come to the fore in the pandemic also needs to be, part of every decision making. Everything needs to be framed by an idea of an understanding of how power and history works and how it works up till today and how it has to impact on our design. And that really leads us to participation, co-creation. Without everybody around the table, we will never understand how people are positioned. And that then, if we argue, if these 3 elements are come together, and maybe there are some elements that might come up in conversations, but these are for us the 3 main elements that might lead us to, a compassionate practice that will result in a commitment to act, to take responsibility, and move towards a more socially learning design. And I'm going to share my presentation because I'm very aware that I won't be able to go into depth in all of these resources that I'm sharing, but I've added all the links to my slides. So if there's anything that you find interesting, you can just visit the slides and read more. So I think Zina has also mentioned the humanizing online. So in terms of care and affect, what we need to understand is that we really need to think about how we humanize our online teaching and learning. So stuff that is so easy for us when we are in a face-to-face, context, because we see our learners, we see the people in the room, we can gauge in many of the comments, what people really said, when I'm in the room, I can see if people are engaged, I can see if they understand, I can see if they struggle, but how can I do this online? So there's a lot of resources actually out there to some ideas and principles and practices how to humanize your online class. And part of it is about modeling your own vulnerability, modeling your own humanity, sharing about yourself. So you invite others to share as well. And there are lots, as I said, these are fantastic resources on how to build community online. Lots of different activities. This is part of Maha's work for onehighereducation.org, and she has collected lots and lots of ideas on how to build community online. But as Zina also mentioned, people go further and say it's not just about humanizing, it's also about recognizing that there's trauma in the classroom. And yes, there has always been trauma in the classroom, and especially at CPT, we know that. As you said, I work with digital stories, and a lot of that trauma has come through in the digital stories, but COVID has just heightened that trauma among everybody and has kind of flattened. You've seen the numbers of people who have experienced burnout, and part of that is because, triggers of trauma are uncertainty, isolation, loss of meaning, all of that triggers trauma. So Maisie Mart, who is a neuroscientist, does some really interesting work around how to deal with trauma in the classroom, how to make it part of the curriculum and how to respond to the trauma. What do students who are traumatized, what do they need? They need predictability, they need flexibility, they need connection and empowerment. So how do you create spaces that would allow those kind of principles to be supported? And again, I've put a lot of links there so you can see and read further. And yes, the flux pedagogy kind of summarizes our ideas really well. And what I like about the flux pedagogy, there's also this idea of, the other side of the story of caring and compassion for our students is radical self-care. I mean, we need to look after ourselves, and it's not just an individual idea of self-care, but more a systemic view. What structures need to be put in place as an institution to actually force lecturers to take leave, to look after themselves? What collective structures need to be put in place so that, burnout is not being seen as an individual, it's not pathologized as an individual problem of one lecturer. It's actually understood as the collective phenomena that we sit with, and how can that be, how can we think about that and, respond to that? But, as I said, social justice and, the systems that, that support teaching and learning, that we know that we live in context of extreme inequity, and we have to think about that. And, we know that certain groups of students are, have been hit disproportionately by the pandemic, and that is gender, it's race, it's part of, economics, geographical areas, disabilities, international students. This is globally understood that specific groups of learners and staff are particularly hit, and we have to think about that. I'm going really quickly now because I know I've got a few minutes left. But, equity is not just about creating the right space and context and, structures for everybody to reach the same objective. It's also understanding that maybe not everybody wants the same thing, Maybe somebody doesn't necessarily need an apple, but an orange, okay, or something else, And the only way we can understand what people actually need is, as Zina said, is by moving towards more co-creative approaches. And we really like this. This is actually a framework that we, adapted from an indigenous evaluation framework. So this was part of indigenous evaluation and monitoring work. But we thought it's really it's really an interesting way to think about co-creation, in teaching and learning and in course design. And we understand that co-creation is not necessarily possible for everyone, but it's really important for us to place ourselves on that continuum. Where are we? Are we in the empathy space where we're designing for students, even if we are trying to understand who our students are? Or are we moving to a co-design space where we, design with students? Or is it about, relinquishing power and understanding that maybe as a lecturer, I'm not always the right person to take this decision, but maybe the students should lead the design process. That will move then into a compassionate space where we understand that how I am positioned is not necessarily always, will not enable me to understand my students or take the right decisions for my students. And that takes me to the last point, and that I think I'm really interested in, and that is the positionality of the designer. I think by moving to what design thinking has done, it has really allowed design to become accessible to everyone, and for everyone to feel like they can design. And it has given tools and approaches and activities into the hands of everyone to engage with design thinking processes and principles. But what it kind of it has also done, it has moved away the focus on the designer and who the person and as the designer is, and what possibly what biases, assumption a designer could have that will influence design decisions. So this is a quote by Equity by Design, which is doing some really, really interesting work combining design thinking and critical, anti-racism work, and trying to figure out, if one puts those two together, how could we create design thinking processes that would allow for more equitable design outcomes. So one of the things that they say very clearly is that before you even start designing, you have to start with yourself. You know, you have to start understanding yourself, who you are, and how who you are might, you know, influence design decisions that you take. So they have added this notice and reflect to the design thinking process, which I think is really interesting. And I'm still grappling how one would do that. And I have some ideas, but this is really something. So how do you combine, how do you make the actual design process a transformative space? So it's not just that I'm trying to design something that's transformative, but in the process of designing, you know, I am being transformed as designer. So they have lots of ideas, you know, on you know, to tip the, you know, Harvard implicit association piece, just to reflect more on your own implicit biases and how that might impact on your design decisions. So I think I've managed 1 minute late, but we believe that if you design in that way, you know, if you keep these elements in consideration and you frame your design thinking by, you know, care and social justice and co-creation or participation, we might move to a learning design process that might be more sustainable, that might be more equitable, you know, a socially just praxis, as you know, Paulo Freire would say. And I love this quote, and I'd like to leave you with this quote as the end of my presentation. This is Sean Morris, who is a fantastic critical pedagogue and learning designer. And he says, you know, design is a living practice. It's never a done thing. It is a medium for building relationships between ourselves and those who will benefit from or be harmed by our design decisions. So I think that is such a, you know, an important thought, that any decision you take will either harm or benefit your students. So in that way, it has to be iterative, it has to be a praxis, it has to be collaborative. You as a designer cannot take or not be responsible for all decisions. A process of doing, examining, reflecting, doing, of never getting so set in our ways that we forget that there are always new things to try. I really love that. So I'm going to leave you with this. Apologies if I've been too fast. My brain was on. I hope you enjoyed this.
Thank you very much, Daniela. That was mind-blowing, and really left us with such a lot of interesting concepts and frameworks and design thinking. And I think that there's some exciting work that we can do at CPUT. And I'm sure we really appreciate the slides that you left for us, so that we can go back now and click on the links and do the research and discuss it even further in our faculties. So I'm not going to speak much longer. I'm sure there are such a lot of questions. So if you have a question, please just put up your hand. Sia has a question. Sia, go ahead. Don't forget to switch off your mic.
Hi, Daniela.
Hi.
Good to have you around. Very, very powerful presentation. But I just want to check. I mean, it's really fascinating to see how you're pushing the boundaries of theorization of design thinking. Now, you've moved towards justice within the framework. But I'm interested to know, because you're talking about equality, equity, and I want to check as to who are you using to frame the concept of justice? And I would argue that how is that conceptualization of justice engaging with corrective justice, or what we would call restorative justice? I'm asking this because of the context, as you would know. Thank you.
I like Nancy Fraser's participatory parity. I think it's a fantastic framework still. It might be a bit dated, but I think it still fit. I think it works so well still to help us both think through the intersectionality of, you know, of equity, but also, you know, thinking about transformative ways, you know, how transformation can either be, you know, keeping the status quo because it's just superficial transformation, or actually transforming the status quo and the systems, and how we always have to work. I know, Sia, you're always like, we have to work with the structures and the systems. And that's why I find that so interesting in the current burnout and mental health and wellness debate, how institutions are struggling to think about a structural response rather than an individualized, come and see a therapist, come and see a counselor, because this is not an individual phenomenon anymore, but it is, it's a collective, it's a systemic phenomenon. How, as institution, what can we do as an institution to change the structures to actually respond to this? I mean, for me, that's a really very interesting phenomena to think about. I hope I have responded.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeet. Thank you, Daniela.
Thanks, Sia. Any more questions? We still have some time. Barunia.
Hi, Daniela.
Hi, Virimai.
How are you doing?
Good to see you.
Thank you very much for this exciting presentation. It was quite interesting and very robust. My question is with regards to the issue that we talked about pertaining to compassion and empathy. My question is, where do we draw the line between being compassionate and being empathetic, and also building students or developing students that are resilient, that are tenacious, in view of the fact that, when these students get into the world may not be as compassionate and as empathetic, So how do you balance the two? Because when they go out into the real life, it may not be as compassionate as we are or as empathetic as we are. Thank you.
Yeah, I hear you. And I think that's what the difference for empathy and compassion for me is. Empathy is responding immediately without thinking. And that's what you're saying. It's often mollycoddling our students, is, as you say, not making them ready for the real life. But I think the compassion space, is allowing you exactly to step back and to give yourself that time to think, how far should you support your students, and when do you have to draw back to look after yourself as well? And how do you include your students in decision making so they can actually be the agentic, the agents of change, or of, be the ones who actually design for their own learning and their own context. So how do you empower the students at the same time, as you're supporting them? And for me, that participation piece speaks to that, in terms of how not to, do everything for the students, as, if you're in a place of empathy, but rather moving away from that and working with students and also looking after yourself, if that makes sense. And again, there are no real answers for any of these. I mean, these are all conversations people have to have. I think where to set boundaries. I mean, we have had endless conversations when, deadlines, when should you say enough is enough? How do you negotiate that? I mean, those are conversations we just all have to have in our departments on how to deal with that.
Thank you very much for that question. Any more questions? Anyone would like to comment as well?
Yeah, and Lara also mentioned the ethic of care. Not all care is good care. If care is paternalistic, if it comes from a position where I don't understand my power and my hierarchy, in the hierarchies between the relationship of students and teachers, then care is not good. You can have the dark side of care. Maybe, yeah, Lara,
Yes.
thanks for that.
I'm just going to read some comments, perhaps that would be useful as well. Empathy is a feeling and compassion is a demonstration of empathy. That's Professor Orowesian. And Kathleen Naidu, empathy is more of having a sense of what the person is going through, but not necessarily acting on it. And I think that's what you've emphasized a lot in your presentation, making the difference between empathy and compassion very clear. And also emphasizing that compassion comes with action. And I think that's quite crucial for us as lecturers, so that we reflect on our students, on our actions, on our teaching and our learning design that comes with that compassion and action. Any more comments, people? And then Lillian said, now I get it. When and how to set up boundaries, not to do everything for the students. Yeah, that's a quite crucial point, that at this point during the pandemic, you're feeling quite, you really feel for the students, and everyone's feeling vulnerable. So the students, if they have a need, you want to respond immediately and wanting to do everything for them. But the suggestion in your presentation, Daniela, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that we need to reflect, we need to step back and act with compassion towards the student so that we can give the best to the student. It could be that out of your immediate response, you might not give the best support or advice to the student at that particular point. And I think it's also crucial for us to consider our institutional response, so that when we have many students in our department with a particular problem, we actually raise it in the department so that the institution can also respond to it, and that we don't feel the burden of having to respond individually to our students' needs. Thank you for that, Daniela. Any last points? But I don't want to talk all the time. Okay, thank you so much. I think we've got a lot to think about, and people will continue in our discussions. As you can see, Daniela, if you have a look at our program, there are some very exciting presentations. It is really, we're looking to the future with teaching and learning, or learning and teaching. So please stay if you can, one of the presentations, and you can join us. We'd really appreciate that. So thank you very much, everyone, for your participation. It's now 10:02. So we're now going to move on to our program.